Hi, this is part two of the talk on diabetes, Ayurveda, and Ozampic. Last week, we discussed the history of diabetes from Egyptian era to Ayurveda to the early clinical experience in what we can be considered as modern medicine and how titrating the sugar in the urine and some of the drastic diets that were tried. Some worked, some were just a shot in the dark, including uh, high fat and low carb diet. And the other drastic operation that was tried was a starvation diet, which really led to some drastic outcomes of patients dying from malnutrition. But they did have some success rate, and a lot of the work was done by the great Jocelyn Clinic in Boston. And then we uh, discussed how the heroic attempt at investigating pancreatic extracts were done in Canada, and Best and Bantig received a Nobel Prize within 2 years because now an important thing is to emphasize that uh, unlike other hormonal diseases in diabetes, we were not actually measuring the insulin. We were measuring the product or the surrogate of insulin, which is blood sugar. And we realized that the body, as we'll discuss now, is that the body is a lot more complicated than a straightforward one-to-one relationship. Uh, and that was different than, say, thyroid hormone and even other hormones that were described. And and the insulin is the one point that I did not emphasize, but because it was not known, at least in the 1930s, that very low level, it has a dramatic effect that is like a microgram, nanogram of amount of glucose infuses inside the cell, leading to secretion of insulin. So we're talking at really, and it required some very sophisticated chemistry and to come up with the actual measurements. And so for about 30, 40 years, people were just doing an educated guesswork of the dosage and everything else. So, and as to one part in a billion weight of plasma. So that's an extremely minute amount. So it's a very finely balanced meal. And it goes up to say about 5 parts after a meal. So you can just see it's an extremely micro measurement that needs to be done. And after 40 years, the interprets biochemist Rosalind Yellow discovered that what we'll discuss is called radioimmunoassay, and that changed the treatment of insulin and imparted further knowledge. Okay, and so we've talked about the dramatic discovery. So I think just to revise, now this was a miraculous cure and a dramatic response, and a very important person who was a daughter of a senator or some politician, Elizabeth Hughes, was subject of the starvation diet, and then she was able to gain weight, and she was one of the first or second patients from the United States to receive insulin after traveling to Toronto, and her weight jumped from about 40 or 50 pounds to 95 pounds, and was a totally dramatic recovery. And at the same time, people were dying of diabetic coma, the young people, and they were saved. And so the death from diabetic coma became a thing of the past. But at the same time, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So along with this, physicians learned to diagnose new entities such as insulin shock and hypoglycemia, which became a bane because, again, it was, as we mentioned, it was difficult to do blood chemistry. It required a special biochemistry laboratory and a large quantity of blood to do blood assays. So majority of the time people relied on urine. which was lagging, and at the same time, dietary indiscretions. People paid price for it by taking extra insulin sometimes. And the mass production, as we briefly alluded to, was taken up by American Pharmaceutical, which was started by a Colonel Eli Lilly. He was a Civil War soldier, and it started out as a assistant to a pharmacy, and after Civil War started a company, and this was their original headquarters in Indianapolis. And at that time, they just were into patent medicine and was very poorly regulated, but because it's a natural substance extracted from animal pancreas extract and processed with alcohol, and so that they were able to ratchet up the production. And okay, so this was, the dramatic change that took place. And at the same time, patients and physicians both were frustrated with the dietary restriction that was needed. So it was, as usually happens, the enthusiasm for medicine, went beyond, the usual scientific caution. And people can say, well, what you can eat, whatever you want to eat, just take more insulin and you'll make up for it. But it wasn't as straightforward as we'll see, and that led to the because we had a very physicians and scientists had a very rough idea about how insulin actually works at that time. So this was, the underlying intricate molecular mechanism and the complexity of metabolism was going to take a few more years before we learned about it. Okay, so and then again, insulin we did not know the structure of, it took another 30-40 years for a guy named Frederick Sanger in UK, who was a crystallography came into existence in the 40s, and with the advances in physics and chemistry and microscopy. And he was one of the first one to determine complex molecular amino acid structure. Because insulin, after all, is a two-chain protein, as we'll see. And then subsequently, so he had determined the sequence, and Dorothy Hodgkins, who was one of the early crystallographers, determined the atomic structure of the crystallography. So it was, so that finally people were coming to the understanding the chemistry. Okay, so there were, and then varieties of other insulin products for long-acting and other stuff were devised, and most of the insulin came from calf pancreas. There were some attempts to make it from fish, which were tried, and but then there was a problem with insulin allergy that was people were running into, and so that had to be addressed. And so that took another few 20, 30 years before people could make a pure synthetic insulin. Okay. Now, again, there are other complications that physicians were learning, but not just allergic reaction, abscesses, injection site, and again, the long-term complications, because people were living longer, so that became apparent, such as eye disease and atherosclerotic heart disease became apparent. Okay, so now we'll briefly talk about the insulin as to now. Initially, obviously, people had learned thermodynamics in the early 20th century. So people were thought that it was a basic symbol of, and with the advance of thermodynamics, physicians were able to measure calories and doing precise measurements of intake of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and were able to get some handle on metabolism, and the calories that were consumed and utilized were being measured. So people just thought that the concept, which was apparent in steam engine, can be applied to human beings, because the energy in, energy out, how much energy you are taking in, how many calories. So it would be like a straightforward thing. So weight was considered, for example, the energy that you take in with protein, fat, carbohydrate, that should be burned by resting metabolic rate, which was measured, and it was a pretty cumbersome method, but it was done on a research basis, never got onto popular day-to-day practice. So this was the simplest. But again, that it turns out that the internal milieu of the body is a lot more complicated. And when kids say we have to emphasize the energy intake is 100% behavior, because, for example, nobody can stop you from overeating or undereating. I know, and there are various examples of it which we're dealing with. But the energy output is not controlled by behavior, because the body decides how many calories to burn, basically. So, and it takes a lot of exercise to burn calories. So I had some experience, because we think about, okay, bicycling for an hour or so, but you may be burning up at the most 150 calories, which we can easily get, double the amount from stopping by at Starbucks, because after a workout you feel like you need to reward yourself, or stop by the local donut shop, and you can easily take in more calories than you actually have burned. And even with jogging, you can at the most, 30-40 minutes may burn about 300 or 400 calories. And while a simple Big Mac that you can consume in less than 10 minutes, would give you, more than 500, 600 calories. So it's like it's where our society has evolved enough to get very calorie dense foods very quickly can be consumed. So no surprise that we are dealing with epics of obesity. And this is another way of that, the hormones. So obviously we talked about insulin, and which almost everybody in the world would know about it, as, at least in the Western world. But another hormone called glucagon, that when the body, as the glucose level drops, body secretes another hormone called glucagon, which will feature heavily when we talked about the new Ozampic like drugs. Okay, so it's a yin and yang of the situation, that insulin helps with glucose utilization and glycogenesis. Insulin can cause fat synthesis, protein synthesis. Glucose is taken up by the tissues, and at the same time, glucagon, has a different effect. So that the balance is to be made type thing. So glucose synthesis. So both these hormones play a considerable role in maintaining this balance uh, in human body. Okay. Now, if you don't eat for certain times, then body starts burning fat. Okay, because the amount of glycogen, which is the more complex molecule that is stored in the liver, that provides you about 2,000 calories. So, for example, if you don't eat for about 24 hours, then you're burning, and you are using up almost all the glycogen that has been made by the liver. And then what happens is you start burning down fat, and the fat is broken down with lipolysis, and it's broken down into what is known as uh, fatty acids, or beta hydroxybutyric acid, or ketones as they're called, and that changes the pH of the body. So, and it's useful for running a 10-mile race at that time, but under diabetic condition, when insulin is not secreted or is depleted, that can come into, so it can cause pretty quickly acidosis, and can lead into a coma and death very quickly. So that was one of the reasons why diabetic patients died, when they were unable to utilize sugar. Now, the energy balance is not, as we just mentioned a little while ago, it's not just first law of thermodynamics, energy in, energy out. Okay, and like for example, so the energy intake is energy that is stored. So it's not that simplified, but the other intricate mechanisms as thrifty genes, physiology, or psychology, because human beings, we are thinking animals, and our behavior is influenced by our past experience and even our grandfather's experience. So that decides essentially as to how much we're going to eat. I think when we talked about in the genetics class, we talked about the starvation that was experienced by the Dutch during Second World War, and after when the food did become available after the end of the war, not only the children became fat, but even their grandchildren had tendency to conserve food, and obesity can be tracked back to the influence of skipping various generations. So that was a classic example on how, without changing genes, behavior can be modified based on past experiences and passed along the generations. So the big principle that I want to get across is that the body tries to maintain what we'd call as homeostasis, and when you are well fed and everything is available in proper portions, insulin predominates. So when the body has excess energy, when in fasting, alternate state ketones are available. So and there have been records of fasting that have been taken place, but obviously they become hectic. The classic example was Mahatma Gandhi, okay, who almost came close to dying many times. So again, and some more discussion about thoughts that not only this, there are other hormones which were identified much later. It's called leptin, which came into that has again plays an important role in providing homeostatic. So when you have a leptin deficiency, the people cannot control, and they would get have some rare. Fortunately, it is very rare, and so people, when leptin was identified, so okay, this is the satiety or hormone type of thing. So and that we inject that and we'll be able to cure, but it didn't work. So again, but leptin was identified as to how it maintains the homeostatic balance of the body. So it works on your brain, and at the same time, there are various neurological influences that send signals to the brain. They just have had eaten enough, and some of them are like episodic, like the tonic signals, which are the hormonal leptin and insulin. Okay, and the other hormones have influence as well. And some of the influences are these messages are sent by the vagus nerve from the gut and pancreas. So it's a very complex interplay of varieties of hormones, which we'll talk about as we move along in the class. So this is a very simplistic way of explaining the pathophysiology. Okay, when in normal stage, when you eat, the glucose comes in and it infiltrates the pancreatic cells, and insulin is secreted, so that maintains the level, and then the glucose is utilized by the muscles while you are exercising, and again the glucose is stored is in the form of glycogen in the liver. Okay. Now, if there is no insulin, okay, when the beta cells have been depleted by internal shift inside the islet cells of pancreas, and insulin levels have insulin levels have dropped, or we have developed insulin resistance, that even though insulin is present, the cells of the body do not respond to it. Okay, so that's when all the haywire goes around, that there is insulin resistance, so it prevents you decreased muscle uptake of glucose, and the glucose stays in your blood and raises hyperglycemia. And again, having sweet blood or glycogen levels is not beneficial to the entire body, and it can cause, again, it is an intricate relationship with causing hardening of arteries or atherosclerotic process. So the increased fats in the body, the triglycerides, that are the smaller molecules that are broken down, and free fatty acids have a lot bigger role in leading to heart disease, strokes, hypertension, all the other dangerous things that we have come to associate with diabetes as long-term complications. Okay, so again, so that was the real simplistic explanation. That was the state of the art in the early 40s. But as with the advance of molecular biology, we have found out that it's a lot more complicated. Now, and some of the same stuff that leads to diabetes, some factors can be changed, some factors cannot be modified. For example, we briefly alluded to various ethnic, various racial groups, such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Indians, who have a high predominance of diabetes mellitus compared to the self-identified white population. And the other factors that we cannot change, we can modify them are such as obesity. I mean, there is some control over it. That's it's questionable at the best. But physical activity certainly is controllable by us. As to what we eat, that is controllable or modifiable by human beings. Okay, so you can see all these factors lead to the cells, which are the energy source of individual cell. There are hundreds and hundreds of mitochondria, which were originally bacteria that made peace with your eukaryotic cell during the process of billions of years of evolution, and they developed dysfunction, and along with that, so that leads to other problems with insulin, and the other factors that influence is the bacteria in your gut dysbiosis. For example, if you're eating a lot of processed food instead of fruits and vegetables, the bacteria in your stomach and intestine flora changes dramatically, and that again, has adverse effects on your body chemistry, and all these processes, including simple stress, and leads to inflammation, and then something what is known as the reactive oxygen species, so-called free radicals, that causes damage, and all these complex pathways of varieties of chemicals that are released at the cellular levels and causes changes in your metabolism, leading to onset of diabetes. So as the time goes by, we are learning as to how the intracellular pathways are intricately connected with causing diabetes. So we talked about the genetics, the toxic pressures of inflammation, and oxidative stress, and so this all leads to the destruction of the islet cells integrity, and the concept of insulin resistance that came into vogue. Okay, and the interesting thing is that we I'm re-emphasizing the point that when you're starving, when you're lean, body has this tendency to seek for food. That's our basic survival instinct that comes to play. It was, this evolutionary, so you cannot fight that. So all the signals, so if you're starving, there is a demand. The brain tells you. So if we are marooned on an ocean-lined boat, you will even eat your colleagues. So the cannibalism has been reported, and people will even boil shoes and eat the leather. So that's the need to consume nutrition and energy is hardwired into our from evolutionary, and that again, we're trying to maintain balance, but that doesn't always work out. And the varieties of signals that we talk about, like the appetite, a starving man will do just about anything. Okay, and during a famine, people have even pawned their children, basically. And again, it's this, so that's a hardwired thing that we cannot fight against. So, and again, so varieties of chemicals, when you're fat, the certain chemicals are released, and that has an influence on reducing your energy intake. At the same time, your metabolic rate. Some people have this, I'm sure we've seen all those type of people who can eat anything but not gain weight. So this is, so some people are just have a different metabolic thermostat, so to speak. And then again, there are other hormones which are secreted when you're starving. There is a hormone that we'll talk about more called ghrelin. That again was discovered in the 90s that stimulates your appetite, stimulating hormones. There are other hormones which are more sort of small peptides that are released that help, again, appetite inhibiting hormones, cholecystokinin, PYY, and the GLP-1, which again, that's the big third part of our talk with Ozampic. So that has a big role. That's why the GLP-1 agonists have a big role. They work on your brain. Okay, so you can see it's a very complex dance, and actually an orchestra. It's not just one-to-one. And so, okay, and just to summarize, how does insulin work? It provides the muscle glucose uptake and metabolism, stores glycogen, okay, promotes liver uptake, glycogen synthesis, okay, promotes conversion to free fatty acid, inhibits gluconeogenesis, okay, and protein synthesis, okay, and prevents the breakdown of your own proteins, because obviously proteins are important for muscle. So that's where it has all the good things that it does at the same time. So that's why, you can build up, okay, an effect on fat metabolism. So, it acts on various other enzymes that we talked about. So along with the growth hormone, which is secreted from your pituitary, it works synergistically to promote growth. Insulin-derived growth factor, IGF, that has been known to play a big role. So it promotes fat storage by promoting formation of various other complex chemicals. Okay, so it's not just work, but it works on all three components, so to speak. Okay, and let's see, so some of the physiology is, may sound very hard and dry, but it's important to understand how the disease process works. And so another term that came across was insulin plays a big role in what can be called as fuel partitioning, as to how it manages all the three food groups very nicely. As you can see in liver, glycogen glucose is glycogen is broken down into glucose, where insulin acts. So glycogenesis. At the same time, glycerol is broken down into glucose, and then the triglycerides are from glycerate. Fatty acids formed into triglycerides. So this process takes place in the liver, and you can see how insulin has inhibitory effect on formation of breakdown of glycerol. At the same time, the arrow shows that it is a positive effect, while it prevents the breakdown from glycogen to glucose, as you can see from the red signal. So this is right up here. At the same time, you can see how it has effect, on the muscle level. It has a different effect, So, and again, glucose is broken down, and into ATP that provides the energy. Okay, and again, that's the direct role of insulin. At the same time, it prevents the breakdown of the protein. So it's a nice cartoon face of explaining to how protein synthesis is promoted by insulin. So this is just a nice cartoon diagram of explaining. And again, on the fatty acids, it promotes the conversion of fatty acids, pushes it inside the cells. Okay, and then the fatty acids are broken down into triglycerides. Okay, and then it promotes. Okay, so again, it prevents the breakdown of lipolysis. So again, so it has a positive effect for building up your body. So it manages all these three components, okay, nicely into. That's why the word fuel partitioning was, I think, to us was very nicely explains the complex role that insulin plays. And again, it's like our brain has a huge effect on how do we eat, and how does eating is pleasurable and rewarding. So it is evolutionary and hedonistic, circuits that are moderated in our brain. Okay, and again, as to what we are, how we have developed, as to what kind of environment we have grown into, as that we grew up into food shortage area, or where food was abundant. That has a huge effect as to how we would eat as we grow. Okay, so again, I think I've repeated a lot of these things. So I think, it just gives you the idea as to it's a very complex mechanism. Okay, and then getting back to the clinical aspect, insulin led to free diet, and right. So, and there was again a false hope that diabetes is curable, but we certainly did not cure it, but we changed it from acute illness, which was fatal, to a chronic illness. And again, for the juvenile diabetics or the type 1 diabetics with liberal diet, people were able to, were happier, and again, physician wants the patient to be content and happy. Otherwise, they would change the doctors probably. So with liberal diet, the children were able to grow and and the growth pattern turned somewhat close to normal. So, okay, and so this was, but finally at the same time, some other physicians were raising red flag that that it's on top of a proven diet therapy, so it was not in as an alternative, but it should be complementary to the treatment that was already working. Okay, and this way we can control the dose and prevent the adverse reaction, i.e. hypoglycemia, that people were beginning to encounter with insulin. Okay, and on the clinical front in 1935, the long-acting insulin, by adding of protamines chemical, was released by Novo Nordisk, and that was one of the earlier pharmaceuticals that was along with Eli Lilly in the United States. There was the big Danish European giants. Because part of the reason might be because the Danes have a lot of cattle, and some of the other chemists, a guy named Jensen, had a lot to do with some of the early biochemistry research. Okay, so finally, and okay, and so long-acting insulin changed the therapy type thing, and again, and some of the physicians just went totally overboard, that titrating the urine fell out of favor by the pediatricians because children were reluctant to do the checking. And again, pediatricians were reluctant to prescribe diet, and a so-called let them eat cake principle became available. And sometimes, again, people, were careless in self-administering insulin. So again, so it was not people, this physicians community was learning that that this was not as straightforward as we thought to be. Okay, and initially we thought that people thought that by giving insulin we'll be able to rest the pancreas and it will start again. Okay, and so that was okay, and but alas, that did not turn out the case. Once the islet cells were lost, they were lost permanently, and there was no regrowth. The stem cells had lost their potency to ability to regenerate. Okay. Now, interesting on the side deck, some people had observed that there was change in people's mentation with insulin type thing. So insulin was used for other illnesses, such as for mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, insulin, and depression. Insulin therapy was used as insulin shock therapy, and it was deliberately under control of situation. Large doses of insulin were given until patient went into hypoglycemic coma, and after that, their personalities had changed, and there are some results as to how well they were assessed, that remains to be seen. But because again, this was before the advent of good psychiatric care, therapy or the tranquilizer therapy. So insulin shock treatment, along with electroconvulsive therapy, was used enthusiastically by the psychiatric community. Okay, and but obviously with the advent of major tranquilizers such as Thorazine in the early 60s, that all fell out of favor. And okay. Now, again, there's a for the clinicians amongst you, they had known that sometimes the insulin effect was somewhat different, that by the insulin levels, will cause hypoglycemia during nighttime and elevated sugar in the morning type of thing. So that was described by a Hungarian physician, Dr. Somogy, as to see it, that people were getting the hypoglycemic effect. So this may have some relationship with the cortisol, endogenous cortisol levels, and that raised the cortisol in the morning, because body produces cortisol in the morning, so that may be related to it. And sometimes, even in the early morning, the sugar starts going up type of thing. So these are the varieties of observations that were discovered clinically as insulin use became more and more widespread. Okay, And now the measurement, as I mentioned a little while ago, that okay, so Dr. Samoji was observation was back in the 1930s, as to the counter-regulatory hormone caused low blood sugar in the early morning hours. Okay, and so this was the way that was just a clinical observation that was relevant for patient management. Okay, and so again, the other hormones, growth hormones and other stuff are related. Okay, and so that's I have some notes about the people who discovered. But now some of the other thing that was important was Rosalind Yellow, along with Dr. Solomon. They were working at the VA hospital in New York City, and they discovered this process of measuring actual insulin levels. And there you can see there are very micro levels at fasting levels. It's quite low per liter, and after glucose it goes up a little bit. If you give and then it tapers down. So these are some of the insulin levels that are measured. So 1 international unit was required to, and so this was initially the research was done based on rabbit. So that's how the rabbit units insulin unit dose was determined. Okay, so it just goes how the experimental lab transformed into clinicals. That's how the insulin units were defined. Because again, in the early days, we had no ways of measuring. The 1 unit of insulin is equivalent to 0.03 milligram of pure crystalline insulin. So you can see how it's a potent. So even if you give 10 or 15 units, you're barely getting 1 milligram of insulin. And that is effective for 180-pound men, or no, equivalently. So for an adult, so you can just see as to how potent this hormone is. Okay, and that's why it was difficult to measure. Okay, and now the dramatic change that has to be emphasized, which is relevant, that insulin for first 50 years was synthesized from various animal products. And as we talked about, that they collected huge number of calf and the pancreas and purified the hormone from that. Okay, but with the rise of molecular biology, that was the first home run that was taken by recombinant technology, and by doing genetic engineering, people were able to synthesize insulin molecule in laboratory in large quantities, because once the gene was transported inside the E. coli bacteria, they were able to mass manufacture this. And so this was not, this was totally synthesized. The insulin gene was inserted, and so this was the rise of recombinant technology that was pioneered by the early molecular scientists on the West Coast. And the company that went on to synthesize a complex molecular structure was Genentech. And their first experiment was on growth hormone, but there are not too many people with low growth hormone levels, so that was not a big money maker from that. But insulin was their big home run. That insulin was harvested and purified, and it's a 2-chain molecule. You can see that the varieties of it's a relatively very large molecule of various peptides linked together, and finally they were able to synthesize both chains and commercialize. And this was initially Eli Lilly got established collaboration with Genentech, and now all the insulin that is marketed in the United States is synthetic insulin. Okay, so we already talked about Rosalind Yellow, and now again, but along with the synthetic insulin, you could think that when it became easy, the cost of insulin would go down, but that it just did not happen. And it's a well-known tragedy that the insulin cost in the United States kept going up from 1970 to 2000. You could see there was an exponential rise from $200 to almost $1,200 type thing. So And finally, when the road was passed for price control during the Biden administration, you can see how who voted for what to reduce the insulin cost. Democrats passed the bill to reduce the insulin cost. So this was the C-SPAN thing. I just thought that would be of interest. And at least finally, there's some reasonable price structure that has been passed, one of the few molecules that, and there is hope for some other drugs as well that is coming down the line. So average retail price rose 54% in 5 years only. And again, there has been some decrease with the, so they were trying to prevent the legislation. So, but that's again, just to get the basic chemistry, it's a protein composed of 2 amino acid chain is controlled by, and so you can just see as in evolution, the organic and inorganic chemistry and covered. So it formed in multiple steps, something called pre-proinsulin, then it turns into proinsulin, then insulin. So how these links are formed. So the evolutionary process is amazing. Okay. And again, just to repeat, I think that this is a connecting peptide is stored inside granules inside the islet cells, and so it works through various receptors and amino acid and enzymes. Okay, and again, it decreases the hormones that decrease glucose are insulin, amylin, GIP hormone, and GLP, glycogen peptide 1. So these are the ones that are being used as drug. And the ones that increase the blood sugar, glucagon, steroids, obviously, growth hormones. So just to revise as to see how varieties of hormone. By the way, the word hormone means arousal. Okay, that was the Greek origin of it. Okay, continued with, I think we still have a while to go. Okay, and so these are the stress hormones. And again, so the GIP hormone stands for gastric inhibitory polypeptide. Okay, and this is the hormone that is released in the small intestine when you eat. It's a member of what we'll talk about when we talk about drug therapy of secretin family, and it's classified as incretin type of drugs. Okay, amylin that we talked about is again a peptide by pancreatic beta cells. It again has a hypoglycemic effect. It has varieties of receptors that are involved in it. GLP is glucagon-like peptide, okay, hormone that helps regulate sugar appetite. And again, it's produced in the intestine after eating, but it's broken down very quickly. So initially, people had trouble with using glucagon-like peptide, as drugs because they were broken down within a matter of minutes, and so it took some very chemical trickery to use them as a therapeutic agent. Okay, and the other effects are, to work down the gastric emptying. So it's broken down by enzyme called DPP4. Just don't worry about the abbreviation. But again, so there are some drugs that have been synthesized that help these GIP levels to stay high up for longer levels. So that's another way of approaching the treatment of diabetes. Okay. And so as you can see, that the science behind it gets quite complicated from just a straightforward insulin. Okay, and again, this is a way, I don't know, just a better cartoon that we already talked about type of thing. So, and as to explains how these hormones work. And now by this time, as to that the straight line red arrow means that's an inhibitory effect, and while the direct blue arrow, it's a stimulatory effect. So that's how the science explains varieties of this thing. So what happens in the intestine, pancreas, and obviously, here in this slide, we did not have liver. So again, so it explains the role of not just insulin and glucagon, but the other levels. So it's a 4-ring, not just a 2 hormones bearing out, but it's quite an orchestra that takes place at the body level. And again, for people had discovered as to how the research was done as early as 1965 as to what happened by a physician endocrinologist named George Cahill, who used to write our textbook of Harrison's medicine. Okay, and see, I think I'm sorry, I can't get my magnifying lens on this thing, so maybe I can if I go back further. No, I think it won't work for the sharing thing because uh, I'm only sharing portion of the slide. So well, maybe I can magnify it a little bit further. Okay. So what he'd done was taken some grad students and had them fasting, and established that yes, that they and did amount of how much and measured their hormone levels. So there was one of the evolutionary advantage that he did some of the earlier research as to what happens when the body is starving. Okay, so that's just some of the experimental research as to how how metabolism is worked, as to some of the work that I already alluded to, as to when we take sugar, it goes up, but then glycogen start breaking down, and then the fat starts breaking down. So because what the body tries to do is to supply your brain for the nutrition that it needs, because brain, even though it's a very small percentage of your body weight, it consumes 25% of your glucose or energy. So major fuels for brain earlier, is uses glucose most of the time, but when it's not available, it uses ketone bodies, or that. So these are the varieties of way it was determined by starving these poor students, for several days. Okay. And so again, before insulin, people get developed into ketoacidosis, starvation in the midst of plenty. That even though the sugar was available, the fat cells kept releasing, fat into the circulation, and liver kept making more and more ketones and acid. So this lowered the pH and related to emergency and death, as we talked about. So that was the pathological basis of ketoacidosis or coma. That was the earlier cause of death for diabetic patients. So fasting stage pancreas, decreased insulin, glucagon, fat cells. Okay, and see how you can see increased ketone levels in the body, so ketogenesis. So this cartoon just explains to you. Okay, and uh, uh, so a body knows when it's been fed. So it's it initially uses uh, uh, carbohydrates and later on fats that is stored in the body. So again, it changes. The central role of insulin is, and the metabolism of all this combined. Okay, that was measured. So again, and the acid that is produced is beta hydroxybutyric acid that was determined, and it has, again, an evolutionary concept. When the food was not available, human beings were able to survive during prolonged starvations. Okay, and so this was the way of using the stored energy sources. And again, so these are for the clinicians amongst us to describe the two types of diabetes. The type 1 diabetes is genetic and has various genes are implicated, is most likely hereditary, but it's fortunately a relatively small number. Majority of diabetes that we see is the type 2 diabetes. And while the type 1 diabetic patients are generally thin and skinny, type 2 are most likely obese, and is related to the immune complex. So body forms antibodies against, which is something called the antigens, which are the human leukocyte antigens that have been associated with abnormality. And again, and it's again because of twins, there is concordance of identical twins and autoimmune destruction of the beta cells. So the body attacks itself, loses its own identity, and that's how. Uh, so it's a lot more serious disease. And as I mentioned in the first slide, the incidence is, has decreased slightly, but it continues in the other ethnic minorities. Okay. All right, so the combination of low insulin levels and normal glucagon levels causes fat to be released and leading to, okay, uh, acidosis and death. And again, and now let's see if I can play this, open this link that was, okay, though I think, I don't know if this link will play or not, but that's, okay, it's surprised that, and let me see if I can. Okay, try to see if I can get it to play in other mode. It's a nice slide type thing, so that's why I would love to see if I can get it to play. Okay, yeah, no, I guess not. Obviously, I'm not having success with this from. Okay, so you get the idea that that's what he's talking about. He's obviously this is a lecture from the MIT Open Courseware, so that's more for uh, people who are training to be scientists. Okay, let's see. Let me see if I can move my stuff around and slideshow from the. Okay, let me pause my recording first. I'll get my. Okay, so we are back in business. So we talked about, ketoacidosis and the mechanism of ketoacidosis. Okay, and again, this is just a better way of looking at it. But this, I think when he talked about in the lecture, that was more than sufficient. So I think this is really hard to see slides, again, but it explains the biochemistry of what goes on. Now, not only that, our brain is intricately related to, so you can just see how from the hypothalamus, there are varieties of hormones that are released called corticotropic release hormone, ACTH, which stimulates your adrenaline, your fight and flight response, the cortisol, and that works on varieties of on gut microbes, and again, so not only just nerves, but the other hormones play a big role. And then again, there is a feedback mechanism that occurs with various neurotransmitters, small chain fatty acids that affect the brain. So you can just say, well, I've eaten enough. So afferent, the fibers that come down from the brain to the various gut organs, including your stomach, your intestine, in your pancreas, and the fibers that go back. So and then again, there are varieties of chemicals that we are learning as we go along, called inflammatory cytokinins, and other immune cells play a big role. Okay, so if you're and again, so the kidneys come into the role. If when your blood sugar is higher than 250, you have the urge to pee. Okay, and the varieties of symptoms that we talked about, the high ketone levels become thirsty, you get a headache, you get dehydrated, nausea, weakness. So varieties of symptoms that takes place, when body chemistry goes awry. Now, then this gets down even more complicated, the cellular levels that the insulin system is occurs with something called the ion channels. So this is the basic the inorganic molecules, the sodium and potassium, the ones that keep your heart beating, have a big role to play in secreting your insulin. Also, the calcium influx stimulates the insulin, and sends the signals to these granules to release insulin. So it's an essential signal for insulin secretion. So how you can see how evolutionary the organic and inorganic chemistry have come together. So the beta cell signals are governed by a varieties of ion channels. The influx of calcium inside the cell causes the stimulation, and there's some of that is the uh, electrical impulse that takes place. Okay, so and so this is the sympathetic system that is works through the adrenaline, and the parasympathetic system that works through the vagus nerves. And vagus nerve is called vagus because it's a wandering nerve which goes all over your gut. Starting from your larynx and trachea to all the way down to your intestines. And just a second, don't barge it. Yes.
Living room motion center not responding.
Okay, so this is the big advance that is coming down the line, hopefully in the near future. Okay. And then again, with the advent of insulin, and there are large scale trials that were done, and some of them were done in the 80s and 90s, and to see whether how good a control of diabetes has an effect on it. And some of the trials did not pan out, and they were a failure and were abandoned, that it did not show advantage in prolonging life. Okay. But the other ones, so some, there were like a 20 country studies that were done at great expense. Okay. And the increased glucose control did not reduce cardiovascular mortality. In fact, they were abandoned earlier. I think, okay. So no, but and so this were aggressive control that were done. But again, they had some of them had some adverse outcomes. Okay. Now, just to digress as to how, to digress, we were concentrating on glucose, but Dennis Begary, who was one of the diabetologists in Texas, had really written a tongue-in-cheek article. What if Dr. Minkowski, who was the original scientist who in Europe who associated diabetes with sugar, or pancreas with sugar, what if he had been ageusic, means he was unable to taste, and then maybe he would have paid more attention to the smell of acetone that was there. Okay. And so maybe we would have focused more on the fat in the diet instead of just concentrating on sugar. So it was suggested that phenomenon of insulin resistance and high blood sugar may have been more clearly understood, that thing. So, but that was one of those intellectual exercise, what if type of thing. So, okay. And now, again, these are very long, but just for completeness sake, we should elaborate them. The major complications of diabetes called microvascular, which occurs inside the eyes, the retinal hemorrhage, new blood vessel growth, okay, and that is treated with varieties of complex eye injections now. And kidney disease, causes damage to small blood vessels, leading to high blood pressure, and neuropathy, the tingling and numbness that occurs, due to abnormal local metabolism. And so there's the neuropathy that's common in brain, that is increased risk of stroke due to hypertension, heart attacks. And again, last but not the least, gangrene of the toes due to peripheral vascular disease. Again, that's a major complication of diabetes, and a lot of diabetics end up losing fingers and toes. Okay. Now, again, now as the story goes along that, after Second World War, even before that, people were starting to see increasing incidence of heart disease in diabetic, not just diabetic, but in regular population. So, and and I'm sure some of you know that during Second World War, the soldiers were sent a packet of cigarettes and Coca-Cola as a gift from the homeland, type thing, for those people who are fighting. So now, and we are seeing the explosion of heart disease that was occurring in the early 50s and 60s. And so Keyes was a scientist, who was assigned to make palatable K rations for the soldiers. And then after the war, he did what came out to be known as 7-country studies. He went to selected countries in Europe, studied the incidence of heart disease and their diet, and published what came to be known as a groundbreaking 7-country studies. And he proposed the association of fat and heart disease. Okay. And that changed the thinking of American Heart Association, because now at the same time, there were in the study that was done near Boston called Framingham study, that showed that there was association of high cholesterol with heart disease. Now, at the same time, it must be emphasized that there was a heavy prevalence of smoking in all over Western Europe and United States. Okay, but as American Heart Association obviously went to the mass fundraising capture, there were various dietary guidelines where were provided as to reducing cholesterol. And there was some original research that was done based on not just in in pathology, but in laboratory, and that led to the association of the Brown and Goldstein got the prize for cholesterol lowering drug, which are the statins, which changed the treatment of heart disease dramatically since the early 80s. and so this were and the United States Diabetes Association, provided various guidelines. So they were, relatively brief, only 19 pages in 85. Okay, it became as expensive as 835 pages in recently. So you can see that your government is trying to help you live longer, whether they're successful or not. But and obviously, in ours, we trust that we have, in spite of that, obesity has continued, and that's why the explosion of Ozampic popularity, obviously makes sense now. And now, from the early days of Darwin's, and his cousin Galton's days, the index was basic metabolic index was about what is the ideal man, because Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, had a huge interest in finding out what is normal man, and along with a Belgian mathematician, Adolphe Quetelet, they had come up with the idea of this the body mass index, and the BMI was, obviously was useful. It's calculated weight divided by height and calculated, so this was, and they came up with the idea of what is normal men, but it's hard to say as to who is normal and what is normal. So we'll have some discussion about that. And the standard definition for at least sort of the Western countries as the normal being less than 25, okay, overweight being 25 to 29, and obese is defined as over 30. And again, now we can see that this is not as simple as, it's not as it sounds. Obviously was useful for a while, but now there are some other criteria that are being utilized, the waist to hip ratio that is coming to the world, and the usefulness of BMI is being questioned. And again, for a different ethnicity, it has a different implications altogether. So again, what may be considered normal for a Northern European may not be normal for Asian Indians. So the criteria are different for different ethnicity. Okay, and again, so this is, we talked about the Ansel Keys studies, of the 7-country study which he associated varieties of illnesses, to the diet type thing. And not just coronary artery disease, but diabetes, gallbladder, hypertension, sleep apnea, and so on and so forth. Okay, and now what there is fat and there is fat. So this is the so-called healthy fat, which is usually is stored in the so-called brown fat and white fat. That is so different. Where the fat is, that is equally important. If it's in the, for example, let's talk about briefly the sumo wrestlers. They are huge. They are like 300 to 400 pounds, but their fat is subcutaneous. That's not surrounding the organs, such as liver and intestine and abdominal wall. So that's a different type of fat, so-called, so that the people are making distinction between as to where the fat is and what role it's playing. And again, not just the appearance, but the so-called healthy fat has a different way of utilizing glucose and free fatty acids, and does not produce the more toxic chemicals that can come and harm and cause inflammation. On the other hand, the so-called hypertrophic or large fat that are surrounding the organs, that is all the nasty things that can happen to you, that thing. And again, this is vascularized in a different way. And you can see that the other cells, the inflammatory macrophages or the eating cells, immune cells, are involved in as well. So there's there's a strong immunological response that takes place to the so-called bad fat. And again, when just instead of just measuring body surface area, the measure that is being used, a more complex scan, is called DEXA scan. Okay, which measures the amount of fat that is around the organ. So it's a dual energy X-ray, and you can just see. And there are other ways also measuring, but this is the standard way of measuring as to how the fat is distributed. As you can see, how the Northern European man versus an Asian person as to where the fat is stored, and that has a huge implication when it comes to insulin resistance is more related to abnormal waist to hip ratio, and even more reliable than cholesterol. Okay, and So this is, again, there is fat and there is fat. So that's the point that I wanted to get across. Okay. All right. And now again, obesity is becoming, and we'll talk at more length about this thing. And again, when it comes to diet, and obviously when I was practicing, I used to attend a lot of the cardiology meeting. And at the end, on the last day, they used to have the pros and cons. That it's like the 60 minutes debate that were there, and between two guys, Dean Ornish, who promoted the strict vegan type of diet with extremely low fat diet, and he had written, his work was very popular and he's still around and promoting, but his diet was extremely hard for people to. But he did show that there was the people who followed his diet did show reversal of heart disease. So that was the first time when, with lifestyle changes, people were able to show. On the other hand, the other cardiologist who was there was Dr. Atkins. So his diet was more fat and the traditional high cholesterol diet that he promoted. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Atkins, he promoted the diet and wrote several popular books, but he never did any controlled studies of it. So there was always a controversial thing as to how his diet was. Obviously, the people lost weight and his diet was extremely popular, and Dr. Atkins became rich. And I think eventually, if I recall correctly, he died of heart disease. Okay, so, and again, with the same way for exercise also. Now, again, diet is a big money-making business. I just at Barnes and Noble just recently, I went and took photographs as to see how many diets that are there, and and the July issue of Scientific American Medicine has a huge issue on why we eat and how Ozampic plays a role, and and the controversies of various so-called paleo diet that is promoted by some physicians and including the psychologist Jordan Peterson. Okay, so it's still, the jury is still out on it yet. And most recently, an Englishman has written a book on the so-called ultra-processed food. So he did, obviously in Britain, as a lot high ultra-processed food because they import a lot of the food from other countries. Okay, so he did self-experiment as to how all these biomarkers became abnormal by strictly eating ultra-processed food for 1 month. And so yes, so that's the big thing. And even the federal guidelines are implicating the role of ultra-processed food. And obviously, and it's a lot easier to go to a 7-Eleven and buy some beef jerkies or like a candy bar, and then instead of paying the more expensive fruits and vegetables that are not available in underserved area or low income areas. So so that's so we have gone through varieties of fads, and the answer is still not out. And this was just the classic example of Atkins versus diet. Okay, and unfortunately, I think I can't get my. Yeah, maybe I can get this, but I think Okay, if I move my sharing thing, I might be able to do that. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, I think this way I can probably do that. Yes, I can show you the pyramid type thing. So, okay, you can see the Atkins pyramid. It starts out with, and red meats, lean poultry. So these are the varieties of diets that were proposed by the two, Ornish and Atkins, as to how the smallest amount. Okay, let's go back to the slide again. So and now a word or two about Atkins diet is low carbohydrate diet, initial induction phase, and then but total carbohydrates, after 2 weeks of induction, carbohydrates are gradually increased to 120 grams. Ornish diet is strictly vegetarian diet with only 10% fat, 20% protein, 70% carbs. Okay, and he restricts simple carbs, basically like sugar and white flour, so eliminating cholesterol, basically because it's a strictly vegetarian diet. Now, varieties of sugar substitute have been around since since the last, since the 19th century. Okay, And these were all the biochemical product of the coal tar industry and organic chemistry. And the saccharine, which was associated with bladder cancer and was withdrawn. It's still available, I think, in some other countries, Okay. And the other thing which are used are there, are you all familiar with aspartame and sucralose? Okay. And there are no calories and flavor enhancer, but there are disadvantages that, there's no, you know, uh, no obvious disadvantages. So they're reasonably safe, at least for the present time, so to speak. Okay. Then again, so this was the most recent news from Heart Healthy Diet does not need to be low in fat. So you can see how the pendulum has changed, type of thing as to, and so this is the most recent thing as to call medically suitable diabetic therapy. So it's a different abbreviation how the therapy needs to be individualized rather than one stick for all. So, okay. All right. So we talked about okay. Okay, I'm trying to see if I can. Yeah, I think that should work better. Okay. So this is the Harvard Health Diet, so okay. And as said, the general recommendation is using, the so-called Mediterranean diet, which emphasized the olive oil using for instead of using, butter and other things for cooking, and especially, palm oil. Okay, increasing fruits and vegetables, emphasizing nuts and whole grains, varieties of vegetables to the menu, and no, obviously, eating three servings of legumes, or lentils per week, include okay. A lean poultry is recommended, and again, save red meats for occasional consumption, cut out the sugary beverages. So it's just standard Mediterranean diet. Now, moving to obesity, is not new, this thing. So it was, goes back to, the early 19th century as to the obese diet was, you know, and this was let's say William Benting, undertaker. So he'd written letters from corpulence. So this has been a problem. And then uh, Jean Antoine Savarine, again, he had written varieties of papers on obesity. So, okay, and he was a French politician and lawyer. So, so people were indulging into, okay, and some of these people, and obviously, their emphasis was, they were writing about Benting was distant relative of the Benting who discovered insulin, by the way. And so he had written books as in the early 19 and in the late 19th century about it. Okay. All right. So I think we have talked for, let's see how many minutes we. Okay, 1.5 hours. I think I'll stop here at this stage and we'll continue on next time. Okay, let me pause the recording and I'll see you folks next time. Stop.